During a period of student protest on the University of Missouri campus, it was claimed that this feces swastika had been written on the wall of a student dormitory. It was claimed that the university president's motorcade had run over student protesters. Um, it was just all of this stuff. It was claimed that the Ku Klux Klan had been spotted on campus, and the student body president was in direct negotiations with the Army National Guard to keep students safe. And as people started unpacking this is one of the things that made Clay Travis, who now runs Outkick Sports, prominent. It turned out that every single claim was a lie.
For the wrong to rule, the good must just stand idly by. Hello. This week I am delighted to speak to Dr Wilfred Reilly. Wilfred is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Kentucky State University and author of Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War, and Taboo, about the inability to discuss race, gender and class in polite society. He's also a regular columnist for Spiked, which we love, and we'll put a link to his Spiked articles in the description below. Wilfred, thank you so much for coming on.
Very glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Why did you decide to look into hate crime hoaxes specifically?
Well, this is something that I became suspicious of a couple of years ago in the States. I was a graduate student in Chicago, and long story short, there were a couple of very high-profile cases. A University of Chicago graduate student claimed that he was being stalked by an entire conservative hacker group called the U-Shy Electronic Army. There was it was a pretty dramatic case, widely reported. The Tribune in our city, the Journal in New York, so on down the line. A gay-friendly bar in one of our posh suburbs, Oak Park, was burned to the ground, and these awful anti-gay slurs, and if I recall correctly, references to women as sluts and the like, were written throughout the bar. Place was utterly destroyed. I had friends that used to dance there. And there were a few more of these. Michigan Tech, one of the mid-level engineering schools in the U.S. Midwest, there was a claim that a student threatened to shoot all of the black students on campus. And as it turned out, all of these, in fact, were hoaxes. The University of Chicago incident, a guy named Derek Cockaline had essentially been sending threatening messages to himself from different computers. And what he apparently wasn't very skilled. He didn't know the difference between an IP address, a MAC address, so on. So the FBI was able, and this got to the level of our federal police agencies, the FBI was able to establish that he'd basically been logging into one machine, in his room or in the suite next door and messaging himself from Facebook or whatever, and then logging out and responding, in horrified fashion to his own message, threatening himself with rape and so on. That was the resolution of that case. The owner of the gay bar turned out to be the individual that had burnt it down. He was in considerable debt, which isn't always the best idea in Chicago in the nightlife industry. And apparently, to deal with the insurance claims or something like that, he'd committed an act of arson. This came to light years later when a friend of his that was involved in a DUI case with a woman, a couple of other things, essentially told this to investigators. He was arrested. He ended up doing some time in prison. And he had assumed that falsifying an incident of homophobia or racism or something like this would be the best way to get through that without ever being suspected. The Michigan Tech incident was a situation where there'd been a fight on campus between black and white men, I believe. And the person who became accused of almost an act of terrorism had actually gone on a Twitter-style platform and said, "This is embarrassing for our school. I'm going to shoot every black man I see a big smile tomorrow." And a campus rival had clipped the post, screenshot it so that it looked like he was planning a mass killing, and then sent it to the authorities. And this led to a case that took months to resolve, where records had to be obtained from the site, so on down the line. But all of these, again, in my area, were front page stories or close. And when all of this was resolved, I remembered seeing many, many cases like this nationally. Duke Lacrosse had been a couple of years before. And I decided that if I ever had a sabbatical or something like that, I'd look into how common this was. And years later, in 2018, 2019, I started noticing these lists of hate crime hoaxes that were sort of making the rounds on debate sites like Reddit. And at this time, the public claim from academics I respect, Barry Levin and so forth, but was that there were perhaps 10 or 20 hate crime hoaxes in a year. This wasn't a problem at all. The problem was growing rates of hate in Trump's America and so on. So I actually I obtained a contract with Regnery, a large, respectable conservative publisher, and I sat down and I wrote the book. And I used a couple of research techniques to find in sort of reputable regional newspapers and so on, all these stories of this happening. And again, you have to debate what a hoax is. You have to look at how many of these made their way up to the FBI. But what I found was that the problem was very, very prevalent. It wasn't a case of one or two incidents. The data set the book was based on was 419 cases at the time. It's now over 1,000. So this happens fairly often, and there's an interesting question as to why it does, I think.
Absolutely. And also there's an interesting question to sort of separate them out between the practical hate crime hoax, which where you burn your own bar down for money, and then maybe the cultural hate crime hoax, and I'm not sure where Jussie Smollett fits into that. What was he trying to make a point about Republicans, or was he trying to get a pay rise for that TV show he did? What percentage of these are driven by ideology, and what percentage of them are driven by pure practicality? And and the why question that you asked yourself.
That's a great question. I mean, I'd have to dig into my data set and really break down the figures to directly answer that. I don't ever want to exaggerate something or make something up. But you're right that those are the two categories. I mean, criminals like money as much as anyone else does, perhaps a bit more when you think about it. I mean, there's a famous Jesse James line about why he robbed banks. That's where the cash is. So yeah, there are hate crime hoaxes that are simply driven by the idea, well, yeah, if I set the pub on fire, then I will collect the insurance money. And because the States is in such a racially sensitive place right now, it's less likely I'll be investigated than if a bar just magically catches on fire. So there's that. But the majority, I would say, of these hoaxes are ideologically driven. One of the things that I found was that an enormous percentage of them take place on a college or a university or a prep school campus. I mean, more than a third of the entire data set was gathered from those environments. And if you look at reputable websites like hatecrimehoax.com, which was put together by the academic researcher Laird Wilcox, I mean, you find exactly the same thing. So in collegiate environments, the motivation often seems to be illustrating what everyone kind of accepts is a real problem as part of an ongoing campus debate. So if conservative students or the faculty senate or some entity says, well, we don't really have a problem with hate in this community, there's no better way to illustrate you do than, the Klan being spotted on campus. But the reality is that in the urban USA, Los Angeles or something like that, there's a 0% chance of the Klan actually being spotted on campus. So if you want that kind of negotiating advantage, someone might have to put on a sheet. So we see of a fair amount of that. Oberlin was the site of a couple of these during the period that's contained in the book. Michigan, I mean, pretty much the places you'd expect. I believe the Claremont colleges. So yeah, the a great many of these are ideological in nature.
In
And
terms of, would that be in terms of in terms of the ideologies of things, the sort of woke stuff of critical race theory and those sorts of things being prevalent on these campuses?
yes, well, I mean, exactly. There was one incident where a student speaker was dissatisfied by the size of the crowd at a rally. If I recall correctly, and these sort of blend together because again, there are 400 cases in just the early data set. I believe this was at Keene University, but was dissatisfied by the size of a crowd at a rally. So the rally was taking place over a day or more. So she literally went inside the campus library building and tweeted out death threats to the minority students on campus and a lot of these people are very good with computers, as in the U Shy example. Not quite good enough, of course.
Sure.
But from an anonymous burner Twitter account, tweeted out a series of death threats like, Black students at Keene, I'm coming for you. I see all those N-words marching outside. You're going to get it. You don't belong here, all this kind of thing. And that was then presented to the rally crowd as evidence of racial issues on the campus. So there's a fair amount of this kind of stuff, and it can be used as a negotiating tool with campus authorities, or again, with conservative students, or with whoever the opposition might be. The
And
ultimate example of this that I give in the book is the University of Missouri crisis, which went on for weeks.
what happened there?
Well, I mean, the University of Missouri, this is it's almost a funny story, but this is 2013, 2014. This began when a swastika made of human feces was allegedly found, and one of the SEC, what was the term we'd use, Southeastern Conference universities in the USA. But this kicked off an entire episode of kind of campus frenzy where all of these demands were made for different social justice policies. And the entire situation turned out to be almost made up from whole cloth. So during a period of student protest on the University of Missouri campus, it was claimed that this feces swastika had been written on the wall of a student dormitory. It was claimed that the university president's motorcade had run over student protesters. Um, it was just all of this stuff. It was claimed that the Ku Klux Klan had been spotted on campus, and the student body president was in direct negotiations with the Army National Guard to keep students safe. And as people started unpacking this is one of the things that made Clay Travis, who now runs Outkick Sports, prominent. It turned out that every single claim was a lie. There's never been a documented picture of the quote unquote poop sticker. I don't really have any theories about that. That to some extent is the least serious of these claims. But the motorcade claim, which would of course be very serious if some public official had in fact run down passionate students in a public way. But that turned out to be a case of somebody walking in front of a parade route, getting lightly bumped, moving aside. There were no Klansmen on the campus. The student government officials just made that up. One of the signs of a hate crime hoax, actually, is a claim of something very archaic that someone with sort of a passionate theater student's imagination might invent: nooses, hanging ropes, Klansmen, burning crosses. I mean, there is an alt-right in the US and UK, but you would see something more like a witty drawing of Pepe the Frog than you would 50 people marching in white polyester robes or something like that in the modern era. But so all of this turned out to just be a pack of lies. But while this was going on, there were demands made: the hiring of more minority faculty, the resignation of the president. University officials were asked to stand up in public on campus and denounce their white privilege. So all of this was used as a tool in bargaining. It was just the issue was that none of it was real. And we see that fairly often in sort of the wokies versus public figures arena of debate.
What I find very interesting about this is it seems to me that the data, if you look at it, in a cold and stark way, doesn't support an increase in violence towards black people by white people, or black people. The main data essentially is that black people tend to kill each other in much bigger numbers. That they're 4 or 5% of the population, are they now? And they're committing 50% of the murders against each other. And this is maybe not a race issue. It might be a fatherlessness issue or a socioeconomic issue. So why this massive hyper-racialization of a problem? And why is there not identity politics played in return, say from the Jewish community or the Asian community, turning around and saying, well, we received this level of attack and
Yeah.
discrimination as well? Why is it one? Why is there one sort of narrative which is acceptable?
Yeah, with crime, the numbers actually aren't that staggering. Black people, counting interracial folks, including, I suppose, myself, are close to 15% of the U.S. population. We do commit about 50. I mean, I'm not running around with a pistol, but I mean, African Americans do commit about 50% of murders, but only about 30% of overall violent crimes, and that's before an adjustment for age. I mean, the average black man, the modal age for a black male most common age is 27, and for a white male or a Jewish male, it's 58. So I mean, if you actually run a lot of these analyses, you see the reasons for the differences in crime. So I mean, there's a lot of this back and forth between blacks and whites, but oh well, you guys are the criminals, well, you guys are the lunatics. I think very often, if you just adjust for things like lives in a city, you see why this is going on. That's one of the things I try to do as a researcher. But yes, I mean, just there is a higher crime rate, and I don't like the excuse making that tends to go on often in black communities about that. There just is a reason for it. You don't need to go into genetics or current racism or really anything else. But in terms of is is the majority of crime in the black community committed by white people? Well, no, of course not. It's actually worth pointing out a statistic here. Interracial crime. The USA releases an annual crime report called the BJS report, Bureau of Justice Statistics, National Criminal Victimization Report. This drops every year. I subscribe to it. So the FBI has my email address and they send it to me. But in a typical year, there are about 20 million what we call index crimes, violent crimes or very serious property crimes, burglary and the like. And of those, literally about 3% are traditional interracial crimes, of violent crimes involving either a black perp and a white victim or a white perp and a black victim. So this is not a very serious problem on either end. But of those, about 90% are going to be black on white in a typical year. There are more white people and they have more money. So if you look at the 2019 is a very representative year, there were about 500,000 black on white crimes, and there are only 59,000 white on black crimes in that violent interracial index coding. So
Yeah.
yeah, the black crime issue has almost nothing to do with white people. Why is that the frame that the media chooses to go with? I mean, I think the simple answer would be the media in the USA, like the media in most of the Western world, one leans left, and two is very sensationalistic. So that storyline of the Klan is running amok in the streets, there's kind of a market for that. Um, Upper middle class white liberal women are probably the leading buyers of papers, watchers of most of the TV shows except for sport. So that sells pretty well. I mean, Fox is the one exception to that, but no, that is not true. The majority of crime is intra-racial. The high crime populations in the USA, quote unquote, redneck whites, blacks, Latinos, very rarely cross neighborhood lines and attack one another unless you're talking about something like gang conflict. So yeah, the storyline of George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin is false. George Zimmerman himself, by the way, was Afro Latino. His
Yeah,
father.
Jorge Zimmerman, but he didn't. They changed his name, didn't they, in the papers to try and make him come across as more white. I'm fascinated as well by this idea because you write about diversity and how good it is in using examples like Somalia of where you've got no diversity at all, and it doesn't mean you sort of a single ethno state, and you've still got a lot of violence there. So I think we all agree that in 2023 multiracial societies are a really, really good thing, especially in
Okay.
places like America and Britain. I'm interested to ask you the difference between a multiracial and a multicultural society, and whether I'm a firm believer in multiracial societies. I find multicultural societies more difficult because just in the last 2 days in England, a boy has dropped a Quran in a school in Britain, and he's been given, death threats and non-crime hate incidents by the police, and yet you can rip a cross down off a church and nothing will happen to you. So, is there an element of a cultural problem, or is it a racial problem? Does that make
Well, I
sense?
think I would agree with you. Multiracial societies, and by the way, like I'm a pretty politically incorrect guy. I don't think they're automatically good. I don't think they're automatically bad. I think what we find with multiracial societies, and this is just hard data, is that they tend to work about as well given assimilation as other societies. Big countries tend to be multiracial. I mean, if you're looking at the USA, Brazil, I mean, when I think of Britain, I think to some extent of the Commonwealth. Um, you know, Russia for that matter, if you look at the reality of the populations in, the center of Eastern Europe, those tend to be somewhat multiracial places because they're large. So you have different people that live there. I mean, the southwest of the United States is the region that we conquered from Mexico. So, I mean, Texas, the former Tejas, is largely Latino. I mean, it's 30% Hispanic or something like that. And we're not going to give it back without being glib. So, I mean, there's going to be a large Hispanic population in the USA. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, it's pretty neutral. I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt the food and music of the country, you know. But so, I mean, that multiracial societies just are to some extent. I mean, the new Commonwealth, I believe is the term, immigrants, West Indian immigrants, and so on, can come to Britain. So you're going to have Black Brightons. So that just sort of is. Now, multicultural societies don't work. That's one of the most established facts in political science. I mean, it's perfectly fine to have a black guy, a white guy, and a guy of Pakistani descent in the RAF together or in the US Marines. That doesn't matter. But they do all have to have the same haircut and wear the same uniform and, know how to work on a plane together and so on. It's utterly unacceptable that they don't. This is one of the most established things we see in political science, military science. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So again, a lot of this is just data. If you have people in a society that, for example, preferentially speak different languages, they're not going to be able to communicate with one another. If they're just different colors, that's no more relevant than Protestant and Catholic. Now, of course, that's been very relevant historically sometimes. But at the same time, Ireland or France is a fairly functional country. Would it be ideal to some extent to have the same diversity of cuisine and art and so on within a homogenous population? Maybe, but that's not possible. The first thing is achievable if what I'm saying makes sense. But the second thing, where people are actually members of different tribes living together, that's not achievable. And that actually is the problem in Somalia. I use Somalia as an example because it's such a good counter to the alt-right. But you could argue that it's not entirely fair because those people are members of different ethnic tribes. So even within one race, even within one country, even in the most homogenous possible example, ethnic tribalism doesn't work. It certainly won't work if you take people from all around the world and allow them to practice the most extreme version of their home culture within your culture. So this, to me, the idea that this should be allowed is pure insanity. It comes from kind of the woke version of hard traditional morality, where the idea is simply we can't stop that. We can't ethically stop it. But the reality is, to have a functional society, you have to. You simply can't have feminism and traditional Shia Islam side by side. They're going to be many, many clashes. So that's more an empirical take than an ethical take.
Well, ironically, feminism and Islam have quite a lot in common at the moment, I've noticed. But if you look at, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts on demography are. In the case of Britain, America's got his birth rate is completely bottom flatlining. Britain's birth rate is also flatlining down to sort of 1.3 if you take out immigration. We do have to replace the next generation, don't we? We do have to keep our economy going. Do you think the demography is a big problem for us with your open border and our open border?
I think that the argument for immigration as a necessity to replace a fading population is potentially logical, but that's an argument for merit immigration, not for illegal immigration or multiculturalism. I mean, so you have to look to some extent at the performance of different immigrant groups. And again, this isn't a racist argument or anything like that. I mean, from my perspective, actually, looking at immigrants coming into the USA, all of them strike me as a black guy as white people. And again, I don't say that mockingly, but about 70% of Hispanics are Caucasian. When we look at Ukraine and the countries that are going to become feeder states soon, Eastern Europeans are all Caucasian. Arabs and Turks and the like are Caucasian. There's nothing wrong with Caucasians, but I mean, I don't see any reason that I wouldn't critically evaluate migration from Caucasian failed states, if that makes sense, as an upper middle class black guy in the USA. So, I mean, when you look at, say, welfare use rate by immigrant clade, it wouldn't make sense to allow in a large population of immigrants to compensate for highly productive aging workers and then experience, say, a 65% welfare use rate. That's not going to get you that next generation of highly productive workers. And I'm not saying that's every immigrant to Britain at all, at all. I mean, as I understand, Asian, African, and so on, immigrants to West African specifically, immigrants to Britain have been very productive. But if you find that to be true, if you find that, say, East Asians and West Africans do very well, and there are other immigrants that clash with native Britons, And there are also techniques you can use to increase the birth rate among native Britons. You have to look at all of that and figure out what would be the best way to keep the country populated. It doesn't make sense just to let in very large numbers of people and sort of hope. You also at some extent to take that classic almost Milton Friedman line, you can't have open borders in a welfare state.
No.
So the reason that you want a growing population is that you have enough workers to support the elderly and the innocent young children, mothers that are out of the workforce, so on. If you have a very large number of people that are reproducing, but the majority of them are not currently working, that's actually a worse situation for, I mean, the national exchequer and so on, than if you had a shrinking population. So again, it's important that people almost amorally look at demography and look at what they can do to keep a stable population or a growing population that can feed itself.
And just quickly going back to the fact that the demography issue, but also the racial issue. Am I correct in thinking that during Jim Crow, 75% of black families were together? They were mother father families together, and they actually had a more of a successful marriage rate than white families did in that time during Jim Crow, which was slightly lower. And then suddenly that changed once Lyndon Johnson came in and bought. Was it Lyndon Johnson who brought in all the social changes in America? Am I right? Am I correct? Is my American history working here?
No, yeah, that's essentially correct. I will say I think we were 1% behind whites in marriage. Whites actually did quite well as well during all of this period. I mean,
But why this sudden change down to 25% of black families are together?
well, as a
How?
right wing writer, welfare, by God, the
Yeah.
damned great society. I mean, no, but I mean, your question is the obvious question. It's a great question. I am what's called a culturalist when it comes to these debates. I don't think that the answer to when you look at something like why is there a high crime rate in the black community, I don't think the answer is some kind of magical genetic one. You hear people online say things like, well, there's a very high rate of the MAOA warrior gene among African Americans and Japanese people. And it's like, well, this is interesting lab experiment stuff. But I mean, African Americans and Japanese people, there's a very low crime rate in Japan or Ghana itself. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And then you see the other end, the Ibram Kendis. Well, it's all due to racism. Okay, well, why did high crime in these communities start 40 years ago? So I think that the obvious explanation is that there's some cultural or systemic variable that really came into play 40 years ago or 60 years ago. And when you look for that, it's not hard to find. So your starting point is exactly accurate. Most of the problems in the black community, and by the way, in poor white communities as well, that's probably the most ignored demographic in both the USA and Britain. Like poor white boys would probably be the most neglected group. I mean, crime rates, dropout rates, prison rates nearly on par with the black community. It's just nobody cares. But that's a sideline issue of mine. I teach and sometimes coach in Appalachia, so I've had no choice but to notice that. But at any rate, if we're focusing on blacks, all of this kicked off in the relatively recent past. I mean, when Walter Williams wrote in he wrote in 2012, when he wrote about the pre-World War II era, in 1939, the black illegitimacy rate, the out-of-wedlock birth rate, if you prefer, was about 10%. I think it was 11%. White rate was even better. It was a 4%, something like that. Um, Now you fast forward to today, it's 73% for blacks. And by the way, it's 36% for all whites. If you break out poor whites, that's well over 50%. Same thing with crime. Crime between 1963 and 1993 increased 500% and increased 800% for blacks. So murders in 1963 in the USA, there were around 8,000. In 1993, there were 24,000, roughly. We saw a drop in the recent past, but then during the kind of Black Lives Matter George Floyd era, we've seen a surge again. So the black crime rate increased about 54%. And right now, again, more than 50% of all murderers are black. So this isn't something that's consistently been the case. I mean, stereotypically, the groups that were at least viewed as having the highest crime rates in the USA, I'm sure we were on par, but were Irish people and Italians. I mean, they're
Mm.
still rappers still call themselves Gotti and Capone today. The legacy is remembered. Those neighborhoods were tough ones. That's no longer the case. We've surpassed them because of specific public policies that were instituted in the recent past. First place in murders isn't, a podium you want to hold. So this isn't something that's historically been unique to Black people. It's hopefully not something that an issue where we will continue our domination. But the real question is unpacking how this came to be. And yeah, I think the Great Society played a major role. You can bring in outsourcing. Maybe that's a point that sort of the class focused true left makes. But yeah, this is all recent past stuff.
Is there an element that's it's really interesting to look at it that way? Is there an element of the fact that you know the Italians and the Irish, yeah, they it's all of the films that we've seen of how they established themselves in America and the crime and everything that was done. But they, as you say, they somehow seem to have gone through a kind of puberty, if you know what I mean, into American culture. But this sudden, the BLM and all of the Kendi and the identity politics and all of this sort of stuff, and this very very strong emphasis on slavery. Do you think it's something that we America will move forward from, or is it something that is going to be satisfactory to as an excuse for everything that goes wrong moving forward, or will the Black community? I'm sure the majority of the Black community feel exactly the same way as the majority of every other community, which is just this is a very small minority of people. But is the Black community going to get beyond this slavery narrative written by upper middle class white liberal women and Ibrahim X Kendi?
I really hope so. I mean, again, I think that's a really good, well phrased question. So, with the Irishmen and Italians, what happened to some extent was someone once put this brutally. I think it was an Italian American writer. I forget his name. Maybe Puzo, the guy behind The Godfather. But it was a line like, "We got the white trash kicked out of us." And I mean, I don't know if I would have used that independently myself, but there's a lot of truth to that. There was a forced assimilation of groups into the USA. The term paddy wagon comes from an ethnic insult for Irish people. So when the Irish and the Italians hit the major cities, there wasn't really a lot of sympathy for their hard luck narrative. When members of those groups committed crimes, the law was enforced, if anything, more brutally than it was against white American natives, or in some cases, even black American natives. There were courses in spoken and written English. There was no welfare system at the time. So I mean, those groups entered the job market in honorable but fairly low paying jobs, learned to trade, so on. And as time progressed, I mean, when you use that term adolescence, they moved up the occupational ladder. And this is, by the way, traditionally what blacks did in the South as well. Now, we were hampered by the black codes and so on, but traditionally you saw that kind of generational progress where one black or Irish generation might be domestic servants, the next you'd be something like brick masons, the next one son might make it out and be a teacher, that kind of thing. I think that when the Black Great Migration hit the North, and we can, again, there are all these things, test scores and so on, were those different for blacks and for Irish people in generations? There's some really interesting stuff to unpack there. But I think in general, the two progresses were pretty similar for most of their course upward. When the Black Great Migration hit the huge cities like New York, though, I think it's about the same time that a lot of the Great Society almost excuse making narrative was beginning. And you'd have a hard time convincing me this didn't have a lot to do with our subsequent struggles. I mean, like that change from 10% to 73% out of wedlock births is just unbelievable. The Irish never went through anything like that. So I think that around the time we would have normally been expected to make that final jump, we were instead hit with this narrative of just complete excuse making. No, 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 your problems are the fault of slavery. I will note, by the way, that an Irishman or a Jew or a Sicilian could make 95% the same set of excuses. The
Yeah.
British conquered our beautiful Emerald Isle and so on. I've been in bars in Chicago. I've heard all three groups explain their history. So that I don't think that would be beneficial, however. The lost war with the Egyptians back in the lost and lovely golden limestone homeland and so on. I'm sure that's all very factual for members of one of those groups, but it doesn't necessarily provide a blueprint for success in the modern industrial economy. And in fact, Jewish Americans, certainly Irish, Italian Americans, so on, seem to have abandoned those narratives largely and gone on to focus on things that are likely to produce success. The point that I'm making here, don't want to ramble, but is the Kendi narrative, slavery in the past is responsible for these problems today, so on. I don't really see that as likely to produce any solutions. And Kendi, by the way, goes beyond blaming the past for current cultural problems. Even if that were accurate, you could just say, well, let's fix the current cultural problems. I don't see that as an inherent conflict at all. He will actually say that the cause of any gap today is racism. So the core of
And
the
he also speaks the language of revenge, which I don't really like. You know, the only way to combat past racism is with present racism. But just as we wrap up, because I've got to go and
Mhm.
let my son in from school, and I'm sorry, and I
Fair,
know
fair.
you had a car wreck, and you had a car wreck, but you got caught
Yeah, yeah.
up in one. Um, I'm is there a huge lesson for society here that when we do start judging people on the color of their skin and the content of their history, and we try to add in things like positive discrimination and stuff like that, we are actually in danger of making every single problem that any community has worse. And that we should really, as a society, go back to that very simple message, which is it's the content of your character and not the color of your skin, and do our best to create a very equal and diverse society, regardless of skin color or religion.
I think so. I think that's a good simple message. And I think beyond that, there's an even simpler, pragmatic, and almost amoral message that society should convey and that leaders should know whether they convey it or not. And that is that there's not really any magic trick out there that works uniquely for Black people or for any other group. There are a set of strategies that produce success. I mean, it's almost a cliche on the right, but you have something like a half of 1% chance of being poor if you do just, four things. You complete high school, you take a job, any job, and just keep working until you get a better one. You avoid a felony conviction, and you wait until you're married or at least 25 to have children. I mean, this stuff is bog standard. It's very simple. So, really, the the more you can teach people to focus on that as opposed to imagine past grievances and nonsensical fantasies and so on, the more likely you are to produce happy, productive citizens of whatever color. So I guess that's my message. Yes, of course, focus on the content of each person's character. Don't emphasize tribalism, but also just remember that there is no special way to treat Black people or white people or whatever. There's one thing that works for all people.
That is the simplest of messages. And I do love those four things. Don't have a baby, complete high school if you can, and get a job. And you'll have almost zero chance of becoming poor in any culture.
Yes.
Wilfred Reilly, thank you so much. An absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Great being on.